Booyakasha! Birthday
Oh,
boy!
siya.
Wow! Lelo, hindi ka
Kamusta?
nagsasabi Parang paras pala kayo ng birthday ni BBM month.
Hindi, pareho. Ang birthday ko is the actual declaration date of martial law, di
Oh
ba?
my God, it's even
Every year,
worse.
di ba? Every year, si Manolo Quezon fights an uphill battle
Oh my God.
trying to remind people that September 21 is a propaganda date, di ba?
Yes,
Kasi
exactly.
lucky
Yeah.
date daw ni Apu Lakay, divisible by 7. Lucky number daw niya yung 7, so kailangan divisible by 7. So, binakdate niya yung 23 to 21 and therefore denied my birthday its honorable role as the Declaration Day of Martial Law, September 23, 1970.
Sila, sinisisi mo
Bro,
si
hindi pa ako
Manuel
pinanganak noon.
Quezon?
Ha?
Sinisisi mo si Manuel Quezon?
Sinisisi ko si Manolo?
Ano?
Hindi ko naman sinisisi si Manolo. Sinasabi ko lang, para si Manolo is gonna have to it fights this good fight every single year. He fights
Ayan.
every single year.
Ayan. Go pa. I heard that Manolo is a happy man, very happy man nowadays, and I'm happy for him. No,
Yeah, I'm very happy for him. Yeah.
Yeah. Mamaya na tayo marites natin. Off the record na lang tayo mag-marites baka. Now, Leloy, birthday boy, BBM month boy. Yan. Marami tayong pag-usapan. Pero ito na. I think, thank God, both of us are kind of done now with our latest, book, manuscript, etc. So, sana you can take a bit of a distance kasi medyo nahirapan ako sa'yo over the past 3-6 months. Pag nilalabas kita, lumulunod ka naman doon sa libro. Like, I know what you're going through, my friend. But, let's, big picture. Speaking of big picture, so ito pa rin yung pinakamalaking tanong, no? Obviously, we went from walang ganyan sa US. Remember, meron dating commercial na isang parang Karen na Filipino from US, tapos parang sa probinsya sila, tapos yung kotse, ganyan-ganyan. Tapos every time na may hindi maganda na third person, walang ganyan sa United States. Anyways, may ganyan siya, alright? And then, 10 years later on, ang narinig ko literal is walang ganyan sa Singapore. Diba? Yung mga Pilipino nag-aaral, sabi ko, wait, that's an interesting pivot. But, ngayon, kapatid, hindi lang Vietnam envy, hindi lang Indonesia, malapit na tayo, Cambodia envy na tayo, bro. I mean, like, napag-iwanan na tayo ng marami sa ating mga kapitbahay. Forget about the US, forget about Singapore. Ito na, bro.
Tatambakan na ba tayo? Tambakan na ba?
Ito na talaga, bro. Parang gilas na naman to, Pati ASEAN pa lang, nahihirapan na tayo ngayon. Ito, bro. So this is the central question that I think you and I have been trying to answer in different formats, and that's why I look forward to your book. Bakit tayo napag-iwanan ng mga kapitbahay natin, right? Especially in terms of economics. Because, Lelo, push back against what I'm about to say. I think politically, I'll still put the Philippines in a better spot than most ASEAN countries. To be honest, I'd rather still be in the Philippines than Singapore.
Yes.
Those countries. Maybe Indonesia,
yes.
Malaysia, I'll be a bit
Cambodia,
comfortable.
diba? Cambodia. And, despite Vietnam envy, I don't want to live under the Communist Party of Vietnam.
Or Cambodia, or even Thailand.
I'd rather, I'm critical of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., but I'd much rather be governed by Bongbong Marcos than
Prayut. Yeah, or
Prayut for that
Thailand.
matter. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, if only we can come up with our own pita, no? Pita. At least wala tayong problema sa monarchy, that king promotes monkey into Air Force General. We don't have, a crazy military na coup d'etat every few years. I would still put the Philippines in the 90th percentile or 80th percentile.
Meron tayong strong liberal democratic DNA na nagsimula galing kay Rizal at prinotekta ng mga politicians natin over hundreds of years, over 100 plus
where you
years.
come from. So, the question, Lele, I'm posing to you and for us actually essentially is, what explains this big gap that politically speaking, I think both of us would argue that the Philippines is a much more developed country compared to a lot of our neighbors. Some of them are literally in medieval monarchic systems, right? Cambodia it's just really a one family affair, right? Hun Sen and his son, etc. And Indonesia and Malaysia, more or less at our level, but medyo ano rin eh. Medyo shaky yung mga political systems nila, di ba? So, but economically, we're increasingly in the bottom half, firmly the bottom half of ASEAN. So what explains this big gap between political development and economic development? I think that's a better way of putting this question.
Idol, ang hirap sagutin ng tanong without making it a bit more specific, and I want to draw from your latest editorial. Kasi sa latest editorial mo, you're pushing Ferdinand Marcos from, sabi mo nga, tama na yung mga Formula 1 na yan. Dapat something ambitious.
Formula 1.
Hindi, wala akong accent mo, pare. Wala akong accent mo eh. Pero pinupush mo siya, sabi mo something more ambitious, and yung ambitious is industrial policy, di ba? So I guess one way to approach this question na medyo mas madali ng konti is bakit mahina tayo sa industrial policy? Because I think industrial policy leads to the kind of development that you see in places like Vietnam, di ba? So a strong state promoting investment and sometimes even investing in the winners of an economy. You see this in the chaebol of Korea. You see this in the Daibatsu of Vietnam. Yung mga big companies na may actual relationship with the government. Of course, sa mata ng Pilipino, corrupt yun. Pero sa mata ng Hapon at sa mata ng Korea, yun ang kailangan para magkaroon ng investment at ng strong economy. National champions. So I guess yun yung magandang tanong, bakit ang hirap mag-industrial policy? That's how I want to narrow it, but I want to throw this question back at you. If you're happy with narrowing down the discussion to industrial policy, I mean, what is industrial policy for you? And when you were saying, bongbong, tara mag-industrial policy tayo, how do you think about it? What is industrial policy for the 21st century?
Yeah, I like how you narrow it down to the industrial policy, but we know that if you break down industrial policy itself, the implications are huge, no? Essentially, industrial policy is a situation whereby you have isang estado or isang political elite which is capable enough of corralling, no, big businesses to serve a national strategic goal, no? In the case of South Korea, in the case of Japan, in the case of China nowadays, the strategic goal is to make them cutting-edge industrialized nations, no? So if you had, the Sony, Panasonic, and then later on the chaebols, especially in the case of South Korea, Hyundai, Samsung, now you have Huawei in the case of China, for instance, and ZTE and this kind of national champions that they have. And we discussed it in Vietnam, they have VinFast. So clearly, you can talk about subsidies, you can talk about political connection, you can even talk about favoritism, given yan.
Corruption, you can talk about corruption.
Yeah. I didn't say the word, but you can immediately say, yes, there's an element of irregularity there, to put it nicely.
Or kundi corruption, conflict of interest ba? Or seeming conflict of interest.
Exactly. But what I see in all of these countries is that for one reason or the other, and we can discuss that over the next 15 minutes or 30 minutes or so, is that for some reason in all of these countries, yung political elite nila, whether this is their dictator, like the President Park in South Korea, whether this is the Communist Party in China or Communist Party in Vietnam, for some reason they were able to make sure na hindi sila yung hinahawakan ng mga oligarchs, but it's the other way around. Now, how they did that, we can have a long discussion about it. Probably they used coercion, probably they used compromat, no? And even threatening them with jail, no? So we know in the case of South Korea, remember, itong mga chaebols of today, Samsung and Hyundai, back in the day, they were even worse than our SMs and, these types. I mean, they were at best making what? I mean, they were landowners, and then later on, they were just making, I don't know, yung mga fake hair and toothbrush and toothpaste, yung mga ganyan, very low-level manufacturing. But they were essentially bullied by the state, no? To become world-class industrial titans. But this was, of course, Leloy, done within a very elaborate bureaucracy, no? A bureaucracy that A, monitored performance, B, based on performance, called out yung mga inefficient. So before, there used to be like 50 chaebol style. It went down to 4 kasi you took out 46 who were not meeting yung export targets mo. Meaning, in 5 years, dapat makapasok tayo sa, let's say, emerging markets. In 10 years, dapat maka-export na tayo sa Eastern Europe. In 20 years, sa Europe and US. So they're very, and then kung hindi mo na-meet, tanggal ka, yung assets mo, pera mo, pupunta dito. They also got very, I would say, specialized access, favorable access to foreign currencies, to be able to bring in the technologies. the state at many times even bullied foreign companies to pass down the technologies.
Mhm.
So very
And in
elaborate.
the case of,
Very
and in
elaborate
the
yung
case
process.
of Korea and Taiwan, protectionism through a depreciated currency.
And
Because
financial repression is the term there. No,
uh,
make imports very expensive. So I always hear this, Lelo,
and in China also, di ba? An artificially
absolutely,
depreciated currency
absolutely,
as a form of depreciation, as a form of protectionism. Bakit
exactly.
natin, sorry, paliwanag ko lang, bakit natin sinasabi protectionism? Kasi kung mababa yung currency mo, mura yung exports mo, competitive yung exports mo. And currencies in these cases are managed to be cheap. In other words, kung tumataas yung presyo ng currency nila, maglalabas ng pera yung gobyerno, magpiprint ng pera para bumaba. Yun yung ginagawa ng
May
China until today.
manipulation. Essentially,
May
there's
manipulation.
manipulation.
Oh.
Whereby
So it's
you
not a
make
market, it's
it's
not a
not market
market
driven.
reform actually. It's protectionism through currency kasi sa Pilipinas iniisip natin that a weak currency is a product of free market forces. No, in these particular cases, parang actively managed currency para pababain and to encourage exports talaga.
Yeah, so they make their exports expensive and they make imports very expensive.
Cheap.
So people would
Exports
say
cheap, imports expensive.
exports cheaper and import very expensive. So kaya nga like parating na Korea kasi ganito sila kasi nationalistic sila. What do you do? People could not afford imported cars because imports were so expensive back in the day.
Oo.
No choice but to buy crappy
Hindi
Kia.
yun desisyon ng tao dahil mahal ko bansa ako, I'll buy only Korean. Ano kayo, ulul?
Di ba naalam mo yung first Kia, yung Pride? Like how crappy that car is? No choice.
Tawag
Kasi
ng tatay,
afford, bro.
tawag
You
ng
want
tatay ko
first
dun
one
dati
there.
ng bata ako, kutsi-kutsihan.
Exactly. So the first Korean cars were super crappy. I mean, look at how far they have come. The first Chinese cars were crappy 5-10 years ago. Look at how far they have come. No, so a lot of this is actually by making it hard for your local consumers to buy imported products. You force them to buy local products, even crappy, but you force these companies to over time reach higher standards and be oriented.
So challenge kung importer ka, wala cheap ka in our eyes.
Exactly.
Parang pahihirapan ka talaga namin. Sorry ka.
And of course, there was also a very concerted effort to bring in technology. So in the case of South Korea, kasi medyo maliit silang bansa, they had to buy a lot of technologies. So they had to pay a lot of royalties. But still, they were able to absorb technology. In the case of China,
ninakaw nila.
malaki sila, binulin sila. So kung ikaw, Mercedes-Benz, in few years, you have to give us stuff. Well, if you don't want, we have other ways of getting it, so might as well give it to us nicely, right? In exchange for market access. So, of course, there's a diversity. What Korea could do is not necessarily what China could do, but there's a commonality, Lelo, in all of them, whereby alam natin sinong top, sinong bottom, to put it badly. The state and the national interest is top. The oligarchs, they're not eliminated necessarily, but they have to serve the national interest. The tanong ngayon is, why, of course, for me, why we never had a similar situation in the
Tapos Richard, sa tingin ko, a lot of people, especially during the aughts and 2010s, they would say things like, old school developmental industrial policy is passé, laos na siya. Kasi information economy na tayo ngayon. It's not about things anymore. It's not about producing things. It's about sharing knowledge. So mag-invest tayo in services. And tingnan mo nangyari sa Pilipinas, ma-services, ma-knowledge economy, hindi pa rin tayo kasing yaman, hindi pa rin tayo kasing progressive ng ekonomiya ng Vietnam. And what is Vietnam doing? 21st century industrial policy, producing things, making cars, old school pa rin. So, hindi ito nalalaos. Bumabalik to. And kahit US ngayon, for the longest time, diba, nobody wanted to talk about industrial policy in the US. Biden is now talking about industrial policy. So, every time sinabi niyong laos yung industrial policy yan, babalik yan. Kailangan nyo talaga yan. Because
yung mga nagsabi na laos yan, sila yung laos ngayon.
Sila na yung laos ngayon, di ba? Nalalaos sila. So I want to ask bakit nga tayo hindi nagkaroon ng industrial policy, and I want to offer, well, we can offer many reasons.
Lele, can I add one more thing? Baka people are wondering, bakit kayo manufacturing, etc. Well, the reason is, as Danny Roderick and many leading development economists from the developing world, this is Acemoglu, Danny Roderick, these are Turkish people, right? So they're not white. I mean, they understand how emerging market economy works. Because in manufacturing, Lelo, you can create job with economies of scale for people who are not very skilled, right? So, to work in a car manufacturing, you don't have to be postgraduate, doctorate, masterals, high-end engineering science. While if you want to work in design, California design, semiconductor design, you really need to be next level training. Ilan lang ba sa Pilipinas will be provided that kind of job? So the problem with information technology is that it could benefit the few Filipinos who can be conversant in advanced technology and advanced English language, among others. Pero ilan ba sa atin meron dyan? But if
Saka bababa pa yan. As AI takes
Exactly.
over, the capacity to do that is gonna drop.
While manufacturing, you can create jobs for a lot of people at a more efficient rate over time. And a lot of these people don't need to be quote-unquote highly skilled. Although I have a problem with that terminology, hindi siya PC anymore. But that's why we're saying mahalaga manufacturing. So when I say industrial policy, manufacturing policy, it's not because Stalinist tayo or gusto natin ng steel company, etc. No, it's because that's the best way to reduce poverty. So practically all cases of successful economic development and moving to first world, with the exception of oil-rich countries, yung mga Dubai, yung mga ganyan types, United Arab Emirates, most of them went through first the manufacturing phase and then went into high-end services, etc. No? Tayo,
ito pa,
di natin ginagawa yung basics na yan.
Yeah, ito pa, Hajun Chang, similar din to sina Danny Roderick, not very similar to Asimoglu, whom Chang hates.
Yes.
He proposes that governance, good governance follows industrial development, di ba? So, Pilipino galit na galit sa corruption. He proposes na pag yumaman ka, bumababa ang corruption mo. And, you know, this is actually more logical than you think. In order to fight corruption, you need a well-paid police force. You can't do that unless you're rich, di ba? In order to drop the levels of corruption, you need to make sure that government officials are paid well, para hindi sila magnakaw at para hindi sila and so that you can attract the best, most honest people in government, diba, who do it because they want to serve.
You need to have a large middle class which can go and protest, has disposable income. You know what I'm saying? They're not desperately poor. They can mobilize. You have to have watchdog groups. You have to have media na hindi yung patay gutom yung mga journalists that cannot be just paid off, that they do their job. So this is what I like about you, Lele, because a few people are willing to say it. But your argument is, one of the best way to make our democracy better over time is actually to raise the level of economic well-being for everyone.
Make us wealthy. Yung Korea in the 1950s, diba, there was a UN report that called it a cesspool of corruption. In the 1950s, diba? Can you imagine Korea as a cesspool of corruption now? No, because they made themselves rich and they used the wealth to fight corruption. So in that sense, baliktad. Hindi walang korap, walang mahirap. Baka kung mabawasan ang mahirap, mababawasan ang korap.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Although, of course, there's no guarantee na kung yumaman ka maging necessarily more democratic ka. Case in point, Singapore, United Arab Emirates, or per capita. So there is also cases
where... Pero even in Singapore, bumababa yung corrupt din. Habang yumayaman, bumababa.
And if Singapore becomes a democracy, I think they'll be one of the best democracies out there because it's a very healthy,
that's a great point,
highly educated society. So, in fact, there was this fascinating essay by Pankaj Mishra, the Indian essayist, one of my favorite writers. He said something like, if only Singapore becomes democracy, it can make democracy look good, right? In the same way, na countries like Philippines are making democracy look bad, right? And it just takes a switch, no? Konting switch, and Singapore could become a democracy. Unfortunately, that switch is not there. But our argument is that if you have a higher level of development, you can also have a healthier form of democracy. So there's no way we can fight vote buying, we cannot fight election fraud, etc. kung hindi pa natin ayusin yung basic fundamentals ng economy natin. Now, of course, Lele, that still doesn't answer yung question kind of paradox of the Philippines, right? Higher political development than economic development. But regardless of that, you're saying, let's go back to the basics, and that's industrial policy. Now, Lele, this is what I want to understand, kasi I think what we have done so far, you can see both of us are very excited about this topic kasi malapit sa puso natin. Both of us have a lot of Vietnam envy now with Winfast and all that. Bro. So we kind of push back against the cultural argument, no? Na Korea kasi mas nationalistic sila, hindi sila corrupt. No, are kidding me? In Korea in 1950s, they were like super corrupt. Still corrupt until today. Tingnan mo yung presidente nila.
Oo nga, skandalo.
They have the most number of presidents in jail, right? The difference is they're corrupt, but something is being done about that corruption, right? Unless here, well, alam nyo na yan. Now, Lelo, let's go to this. So you and I are pushing back a little bit against the culturalist argument, if I can put it that way, the Orientalist argument, which you really hate, diba? Yung Filipino kasi corrupt talaga, yung mga ganyan nonsense na argument. But still, Lel, I want to understand, no? I have my own provisional answers, but parang ano yun eh, sabi ni Fukuyama, it's like a turtle over another turtle. No, the more turtles I find, there's another turtle I cannot answer, right? So we explain why other countries succeeded. We can kind of explain why Marcos failed, which is what we're gonna do. But I want to also understand, did Marcos really have a chance ever to build the developmental state that we had in other countries, assuming he were not so corrupt and so greedy? And let me be a little bit Ilocano, assuming he were healthy through and through. Because one Ilocano argument is that one reason the martial law system worked is because nagkasakit siya. And so that's one version. Of course, I don't 100% buy it, but you cannot also deny when the one-man system, that one man is unwell, the whole system will be unwell.
Kasi tsaka confluence nagkasakit siya nung nagkaroon ng economic crisis, nagkaroon ng oil shock, 'di ba? Pinatay si Ninoy. Lahat na eh, nagsama-sama na eh. So yeah, this is my kind of first intervention here. Bakit walang industrial policy? Ang sagot ko, dahil ever since 1902 actually, may palusot since 1902. At maraming palusot for industrial policy. So, ang una nating big palusot is from roughly 1902 until the 1970s, until the early 70s, we had free trade with the United States or free trade agreements with the United States. Ibig sabihin nito, yung mga exporters natin, pwede silang tatamad-tamad, pwede silang hindi mag-upgrade ng technology nila, at yung government natin didn't really need to do much to encourage them dahil tatanggapin ng US export duty-free yung export natin ng asukal. At kaya ang export sa Pilipinas ay naging equal sugar. So, sino mayayaman for most of the 20th century? The Negros sugar barons, because they had free trade. Walang taripa pagpasok sa US dahil meron tayong most favored nation status sa US, di ba? So, like ang daming crisis nito. So, for example, the 1920s Great Inflation Crisis. Many countries after World War I, nagkaroon ng malaking inflation dahil deflation rather, sorry. Nagkaroon ng malaking deflation dahil bumaba yung demand. So yung what people would make from exports bumaba kasi bumababa rin yung global demand. Now, the Great Deflation hurt a lot of places, including the Philippines, including Japan, including Thailand. But if you look at how long Thailand was hurt by the Great Deflation, roughly they're saying the crisis lasted until 1928, 1929 sa kanila. Sa atin sa Pilipinas, the Great Deflation lasted roughly until 1924, ganyan. Why? Because tumaas ulit ang demand sa US, nagkaroon ng roaring 20s, and we were able to export to them again. Another example, 1930s.
So we're looking at the critical junctures here, no? I think that's the best way of putting it. Medyo Benedict Anderson style, no? So, so this is the second critical juncture. What is the next critical juncture? Now,
siguro malaking critical juncture. So let's say the critical juncture of the early 20th century. So 1930s, we had the global Great Depression. Napakalinaw that the Great Depression was very, very blunted sa Pilipinas as compared to our neighbors. I was looking at the data here. Parang yung contraction natin was like half the contraction of the Dutch East Indies, for example. So hindi tayo gano'n tinamaan ng Great Depression. Bakit? Kasi as the US was increasing its tariffs on everyone else, including Latin America and including other places on Southeast Asia, they could not increase tariffs on the Philippines even during the Great Depression dahil meron tayong free trade agreement. So buhay na naman yung sugar industry natin.
So insulated.
Insulated. And because our exporters were never stress tested. Tingnan mo, lumulusot ng crisis ng Great Deflation, lumusot ng Great Depression. Never sila na stress test. Wala silang pakialam, right? And because the government was never stress tested as well, they didn't really need to invest in these particular companies, to modernize these particular companies, and to ensure na mag-diversify yung exports. And the other reason, and this is another reason why we really didn't depreciate in the 1940s or 1950s, because in the 1940s, 1950s, diba, Taiwan, Korea, they're depreciating their currencies to ensure na mag-expand yung export market nila by making their exports competitive. We didn't need to do that because we had privileged access to the US. So yung free trade agreement natin with the US, it was our greatest, for me, one of our great. On its face, it's such a gift, diba? Parang access to this large market.
It was a curse for you. It was a curse.
naging tamad tayo as exporters dahil nandun yung US. Kailan nag-shut down yung free trade privilege na yun? 1970s. And we can talk about how Marcos tried to respond to that, because yung shutting down of the US market had been the greatest fear of all Filipino presidents. Actually, si Manuel Quezon, for example, when he was negotiating the Commonwealth Agreement, in private, muntik na yang umayaw na maging independent ang Philippines. Even though bombastic yan in public, kailangan independent yung Philippines. In private, he was deathly afraid of Philippine independence dahil takot na takot siya na baka magsara ang free trade benefits. And ever since, from Quezon onwards, that was the greatest fear. Ano mangyayari pag magsara yung free trade benefits?
Ganon ka-dependent siya. So essentially, we were like privileged, semi-talented kid, pero insulated tamad ang labas. So never fully realized its potential. Kind of sounds like mga anak ng mga politiko. Super konyo. Parang konyo. An image of a konyo comes to my mind when you explain this first. By the way, I find this fascinating because I've always obsessed over the second half of the 20th century onwards, no? But you're absolutely right. Ako naman, I think corollary to what you have been arguing from kind of a state building, state formation point of view, that insulation also prevented the creation of a kind of a strong bureaucracy that can engage. Because you cannot have industrial policy, Lele, unless you have a strong culture of Mandarins who are focused on, not naman Chinese, I mean bureaucrats, technocrats, who are long-term strategically oriented. For some reason, we didn't have that. And not to mention, of course, we were colonized by late 19th century America. This is pre-FDR America, which is a completely libertarian, anti-state, anti-bureaucracy America. So I think that was also the curse of the Philippines, which is quite unique to the Philippines.
And ito, parang for me, one of the unsung heroes of Philippine economics, si Sergio Osmeña. Sergio Osmeña was the father of Filipino developmentalism in the early 20th century, and he wanted to regulate state developmentalism. He set up institutions like the Board of Traders. He set up boards, and he set up and he helped facilitate the creation of various state-led companies, including the PNB, which he turned into a system of national development. Unfortunately, nung Great Deflation of 1920s, nagkaroon ng crisis, global crisis. Yun nga, the highly libertarian Americans blamed Osmeña for it. And so a lot of the Osmeña institutions, as a result of yung blame ng 1920s, shinut down nila. So na-repudiate si Osmeña. And even nung naging presidente na si Osmeña, hindi na niya mabalikan yung
libertarian backlash.
Yung libertarian backlash. So there was one brief moment where Osmeña was actually tinkering with this, and then the Americans shut it down and said corrupt si Osmeña. Tapos yung effort.
Even if let's argue that totoo ng corrupt si Osmeña, but I mean that's an infant state building kind of, developmental state. So there'll be mistakes here and there. So in short, hindi binigyan yung pagkakataon. Like the few times na itong batang konyo wanted to go on his own, medyo pumalpak siya. Di sabi ng family, wag ka na go on your own, just stay family business. Parang ganun nangyari. Now, I'm gonna add another thing which I think will put us perfectly going to the second half because papasok ng BSP. Let me add this. Lawyerism. I think another thing we inherited from Americans is this very lawyer-dominated mindset when it comes to public administration, right? Like, go by the letter of the law, allow lawyers to run the whole show. And I think that eventually explains why the people who end up even running the Philippine Bangko Sentral were people with very legalistic, right, kind of mindset, which is, of course, brings us to your favorite bête noire of the Philippine.
Ayaw lang bakit balik ka ng aking favorite villain.
Exactly. I mean, good person, good moral style, everything, good lawyer.
I'm not sure good person. Ano, new sports car every 2 years.
Oh, well, I didn't know that. No,
only flew first class. Had his suits made in Savile Row. Had his shirts made in the same shop as where the British royalty had. I'm talking about the first central bank governor, Miguel Cuaderno. And then insisted that the rest of the country be
sa libro mo? Parang wala sa libro mo, bro.
Ngayon, dito sa bagong libro.
Exactly. Wala yan sa libro mo, di ba? Parang sa libro mo, it came off as if, because I'm relying on you, bro. I'm relying on your work. The way it came off to me is yung kalaban niya, right, was the one who was Araneta, no?
Pony Boys.
He's like the posh guy, kind of like a Lord Byron type with great ideas, but kind of misunderstood and all. And then Miguel Cordero is the more like play it by the book guy, yung lawyerly na traditionalist as nakabarong parate. Alam mo yung mga ganon. Yung pala
Savile Row, peak lapel suits, double-breasted or with vest. Bakit ka naka-vest sa Pilipinas?
Ako, nagbe-vest ako.
Hindi po mainit. Pero hindi naman ata Savile Row ang suits mo, di ba? So,
and sports car.
And change this sports car every 2 years. I can show anybody who wants to see the documentation.
Okay.
I can
now
show them.
I have questions on the moral also, by the way. So yun lang, hindi lang lawyerly, medyo trapo-y. So okay. So operator nga si Kuya. God bless his soul, but we have to be on. Thank you, Lela. I didn't know that. I didn't know. I always thought this is just a question of someone with the right heart in the wrong mind or something like that. But apparently,
also the other knock against him is because siya yung nag-authorize ng loan sa Coangco family to get Hacienda Luisita.
Alam na this. Hacienda Luisita. Alam niyo na this. Pasok DDS. Yan. So, bro. So, can you explain? Was that inevitable that someone like like Amigo Miguel, kasi very three-piece suit and sports. I'll call it Amigo Miguel. Was it inevitable that someone like him would end up in that august position, very influential position? Because as our Japanese colleague wrote, Philippine development can be also understood through the role of the Philippine Bangko Sentral. No, I mean state building essentially through Bangko Sentral. So can you explain to us, Leloy, itong history again? Again, hindi ako nagyayabang, Lelo, but I think we're the only ones so far who are doing really this way, no? Like really going into the weeds, no? And looking at the history. So I don't understand the contingency versus structural patterns.
Well,
someone like him will end up there.
Nung panahon kasi na yun, the World Bank and the IMF were all for expensive currencies because they didn't want currencies debased. Yung idea na a weak currency leads to inflation, and may gender discourse pa yan, parang unmanly pa daw yung weak currency. And until the 1990s, according to Don Paderanga, ginagamit pa rin, the late great Don Paderanga, ginagamit pa rin yung language na yun na unmanly to depreciate sa central bank natin. And so Miguel Cordero, remember, he was the president of the board of governors of the World Bank. And according to him, why did he receive, or the IMF pala? So why did he receive such, why was he so, World Bank or IMF? One of those. Anyway, and according to him, in one of his speeches, why was he so privileged? He said it's because he was the spokesperson of a strong currency in the third world. So in other words, he saw himself as the guarantor of a world order that was defined by the IMF and World Bank. He was the guarantor of that world order in the third world, and he would create an example of the Philippines. And so the Philippines had so much pride around yung strong currency. So merong mga absurd moments in Philippine history, for example.
But that's very British too, no? You like protect the pound at any cost. Remember the George Soros episode and all of how it was emasculating for the British that their currency in a sense, that's very British influence, very British pound.
You know, strange yung British because that was the domestic discourse, right, in Britain. Pero in Southeast Asia, they loved silver. So at no point did the British banks in Southeast Asia encourage an expensive currency through gold. They actually loved the cheap currency ng silver. Whereas the Americans were actually more consistent. So if you read the documents ng American Congress, they believed that America would be the consistent empire. Sa kanila, the Britain was the inconsistent empire. Like you preach gold, you preach hard money in India, you preach hard money in Britain, but abroad, you're hypocrites. So Americans, we will be consistent. So it's actually hyper-American in that sense. Sorry?
Let me call it financial toxic masculinity or
financial toxic
monetary toxic masculinity.
So ang daming episodes na show how absurd the Philippines is when it comes to this. So for episode number 1, 1930s, bago pa dumating si Cuaderno, Americans go off the gold standard. The Americans effectively not go off, but kind of depreciate the dollar relative to gold. So depreciated yung currency. Ang sabi ng mga Pilipino, huh? That is so weak. In order to establish national independence, there were proposals. We should go on our own Philippine gold standard that restores the value of the peso. Ganyan. Second episode.
Miente.
Second episode, si Andres Soriano was the finance minister of Quezon, government in exile. Now, the Philippine government is trashed. It's absolutely trashed kasi Japanese occupation. Ngayon, nagkaroon ng meeting before the Bretton Woods conference between Soriano and representatives of Harry Drexler White in the Treasury Office. Dating si Soriano doon, bumagsak daw yung panga ng mga Amerikano from the Treasury Office kasi sabi niya, the Philippines has a strong currency and will not need your help. Ginanon daw ni Soriano.
Parang may pagka-Robin Hood to.
Bumagsak daw yung mga panga. Tapos, yung isa pang funny episode dyan, a UN economist by the name of Shirley Jenkins went to the Philippines after the war, and she said this is one of the strangest countries in the world, and she called it a poor little rich country. Bakit poor little rich country? Because it's the most destroyed country in the world. Diba?
Ang angas.
Most destroyed country in the world, Warsaw, diba? After Warsaw, Manila was the most destroyed city, diba? Sira yung buong bansa, may balance of payments crisis. So poor country, pero rich country kasi expensive yung peso. So Shirley Jenkins found it so absurd. She called the Philippines the poor little rich country of Asia. So I think meron talaga tayong legacy of being the poor little rich country of Asia. You know, maghirap na tayo, basta mahal yung piso, okay, we're good.
Bro, napanood mo yung movie na Blue Jasmine ba yun or something yung kay Kate Blanchett? Yung she goes from rich to poor. As you watch that, she won the Oscars for that, no? Parang I'm imagining that a character trying to still live as a rich person nung hindi na siya mayaman. And look at how absurd it's gonna look. Parang pag dinidate siya ng mga common men, parang nandidiri na siya, yung parang sa chocolate, sa rose. Parang it kind of reminds me of that, no? May pagka Blue Jasmine feels with that. I mean, but that tells you, Leloy, no, na how deracinated our elite really are, no? Na parang they're so removed from the reality. Sobrang coops talaga.
So yun yung early 20th century. And then, so we can go to Marcos now. In a way,
but before going to the Marcos, I want to understand that 15, 20 years, that 20 years before Marcos coming in, I want to understand what went wrong there. I mean, I know, but let's flesh this out more systematically than we do. Kasi usually we just discuss it and then pass through it para lang mabash natin yung mga local economists na iba dyan. But I want to do it fairly this time. No, wag na tayo magbardagulan. No, let's go through this because Leloy, again, the other paradox. The Asian Development Bank is in Manila because we were recognized as one of the most promising economies in the post-colonial world. By early 1960s and late 1950s, we were one of the fastest growing economies around, alongside Czechoslovakia, South Korea, Iran, those types of countries, fast growing, rising economies. Lahat sila mas mayaman sa atin. Lahat ng mga bansa na ito na minimension ko ngayon, no? Despite all the turn and twists of history. Was that kind of like the I don't know, like the not lull before the storm, but kind of like the party before the storm, like this illusion of the smoke and mirrors ba yan?
Smoke and mirrors, pero let's give credit to President Quezon. First give credit to President Quezon. He was absolutely afraid na mawala yung free trade benefits, and he believed na yari ang kanyang presidency if he did not get free trade benefits for the Philippines. So I mean he started the negotiations, pero after the war, you get the Bell Trade Act and the Laurel-Langley Act, which preserved some form of free trade between the US and the Philippines, although they extracted a lot from us also. And we can talk about what they extracted from us in order for us
military basing access and access
military basing, control over our currency, parity rights. Well, parity rights not the worst thing, but for, of course, the left, that was the worst thing that America ever did for the rectonial legacy, of course. That was the worst thing that America ever did to us. So may marami ring extractions na nakuha from us.
Lele, sorry for cutting you there. Again, mahirap talaga dalawa tayong our mind is running very fast because it's very exciting. But I just want to pin it down. Can we characterizing as a situation? You can see where my argument is coming. Now, my argument is something like, yung elite natin, binenta nila yung bansa natin in exchange for market access for their own industry.
Market access. Yes, yes, yes.
Can I put it that way? Because
Yes,
I put it that
absolutely.
way. Protection
I mean, I
of our
never thought that way. I'm gonna steal that. I'm gonna keep using that turn of phrase. I'll credit you, but parang that's a great turn of phrase. Like you
Diba?
gave up everything for market access. Parang tunnel vision ba? Yun lang yung gusto nila eh.
Nenta nila yung nanay nila para sa business nila, something like that. Nung nanay nilang bansa, diba? Like that really happens to me, bro.
So smoke and mirrors talaga. In the sense that sino ba namang bansa ang may free trade access to the largest growing economy of the world, the emerging superpower, the emerging only superpower of the 20th century? Sino bang bansa na may privilege access doon ang hindi yayaman in the 1950s, 'di ba? That's like eng ka na lang kung hindi ka mayaman by the end of the 1950s. But obviously, hindi if that doesn't create, if you don't use that to create strong industrial policy, that's only gonna last you so long. And of course may tanning yun, because credit to our politicians, they were able to negotiate the Laurel-Langley Act, which would allow for free trade benefits until the 1970s. But by the 1970s, Philippines, you're on your own now. You have to find new markets. And I think from the 70s onwards, we never really found our new markets.
But a new market opened up in a sense of OFWs, right? Again, people forget that the whole OFW, unfortunately, this human exporting, labor exporting industry is a product of the 1970s and during the Marcos era. And this has served since then as a kind of a transmission belt, no, to get out the stress out of the system and exhaust valve, no? So, parang it's like a conspiracy of factors talaga, constantly keeping us away from developing that. But Lelo, let's do this. Pag-usapan natin, so where did Gerardo Sicat and et al. Go right and where did they go wrong? Because at least there was a faint attempt at building a developmental state, right?
Ito yung lagi kung basahin mo si Sicat, very swabe siya eh, pero ultimately one of the points that he makes consistently, sometimes more directly than not, is naghahabol kami. By the time we got to the 70s, naghahabol kami kasi wala naman talagang developed export industry. Napaka-narrow ng export industry. Essentially, asukal, di ba? So, hindi namin na-diversify. And sasabihin niya, if you look at yung kalaban natin or yung kakompetensya natin, which was Korea and Taiwan, inunahan na nila tayo eh. So, by the 1950s, nag-depreciate na sila. Hindi sila dependent on the US market. So, nagsimula sila. They had a 20-year head start. So, what do you expect us to do in the 1970s? Laging ganun yung point is Sikat eh. And, I don't know, I wanted to ask, how do you feel about that? Because of course, emotionally charged ng issue na to, this is a Marcos technocrat eh, diba? And on its face, parang nagpapalusot.
Well, I mean, ako naman, hindi naman ako hater, no? Just because you work in the wrong administration, you're totally evil. In the same way na you may have worked in the right administration and you're the trapo one and the black sheep one, right? Ako naman, thanks to you, I'm always trying to reassess and recalibrate my assessment of certain individuals in history, including, hindi ko alam pala, si three-piece boy and the second London three-piece sports car boy. Now, again, I buy the argument na medyo hindi sila swerte kasi hindi lang sila naunahan ng Korea and Taiwan. The other thing I hear, and I keep on hearing this from people like si Mike Coanco, right? Which is natamaan ng oil crisis noong mid-1970s. So meron pa yung ganitong factor. So I do agree that there's some mitigating factors. But my sense, Lelo, again, I know you may have a quite different take on this, is that kung hindi lang sana sobrang corrupt yung at kung hindi lang sana sobrang dependent dun sa mga cronies na walang kwenta, I think may chance pa tayo na ito Leloy, feeling ko hopeless case na yung habulin yung Korea and Taiwan, pero Thailand, feeling ko kaya natin ng Thailand noon eh. Kasi if you look at the works of yung Lodi natin, si Walden Bello, di ba? Yung kino-compare niya parating Thailand at Philippines. Sa Thailand level, kaya pa natin noon eh. And yet, Ito,
Mhm.
tanggap ko na Korea, medyo nalampasan na tayo at naswertahan sila kasi 60s na sila nag-start mag-industrialize ng gusto. Pero hindi ko matanggap yung excuse na bakit pati Thailand na pag-iwanan tayo. Ngayon, panahon natin, Vietnam, Indonesia na rin. But so for me, I think we could have kept the Thailand level legitimately and becoming something like the Detroit of Southeast Asia along with Thailand. I think that was kind of doable. Even if I agree that Thailand has an advantage of being, I mean, continental state next to China,
Yes.
have a strong history of state building because they were never colonized, blah, blah, blah. I understand that. Pero yung the fact na sobrang napag-iwanan, I mean, Thailand's per capita income, Lelo, is more than twice than us. Hindi ko man, how could
Okay.
Thailand be twice richer than the Philippines when we're almost the same, even towards the end of the martial law period? So, yun ang hindi ko matanggap, yung Thailand, Lelo. Yeah. So, I kind of agree na si Jerry has an excuse to say na pag-iwanan tayong Korea. So, hindi natin matali yan. Pero yung Thailand, hindi ko matanggap yun. And my big argument is that Marcos relied on the wrong cronies and it was the tail wagging the dog rather than the state corralling the oligarchs.
Yeah, and I want to say something to be fair to Jerry Sikat. So there's this very interesting book na it compares industrial trade policies of Taiwan and the Philippines. Published in 1971. Now Sikat entered the government late 1970, 1971. And this was published in 1971. Pero sinulat to ni Jerry Sikat in the late 60s. So medyo late na published. So this is an index of Sikat's views prior to, nung pure academic pa lang siya, wala pang bahid ng Marcos.
Exactly.
And
Katulad
so,
natin siya.
You can say na hindi nagpapalusot si Jerry Sikat dahil he made that point even before na napag-iwanan na tayo that we have na kailangan natin maghabol even before joining the Marcos government. So I would take that as evidence of him being sincere in that point because he made that point even before he was part of the government. And it's this book, that Sikat and Power, which is actually a classic book on the reasons why napag-iwanan tayo in the 50s and 60s.
Yes.
I highly recommend this book.
So in this way, I think that book will help you understand bakit napag-iwanan tayo ng Taiwan and South Korea. But the Thailand one, I think people like Walden Bello have done decent work. No?
Yes.
Decent work on Thailand one. So bago tayo pumuntang Vietnam, Indonesia, isa-isahin natin lahat ng bansa na talagang iniwan tayo in the dust.
Everyone who's slapping us.
Yes. So yun nga bro. So this is where medyo hindi naman disagree sa'yo. I just felt na I understand what you're trying to do is to put nuance because the standard liberal argument is that, you know, to heck to all of them, lahat sila corrupt, and there's so much going on. And I think the biggest weakness with the standard liberal argument in the Philippines is that they overlook the smoke and mirrors prior to Marcos. So I'm not downplaying the the catastrophic economic record of Marcos, but it's not like things were super solid before Marcos came in. Because tell me, what were our major industries in the 50s and 60s? In the same way, I'm gonna ask you after Marcos, ano po yung version natin ng VinFast, anong version natin ng National Steel? Wala, puro mga kapalpakan lang nangyari. Parang tatay style din.
Alam mo yun, for everybody who says that the 1950s was some period of plenty for the Philippines, pagbasa kayo ng dyaryo, basa kayo ng Free Press, go to your library, read the Free Press. In the late 1950s, every single editorial ng Free Press, I tell you, like every other week ng Free Press, may discussion of increasing unemployment. Like everybody, because there are no jobs, because there's no industry, right? And wala pang employment statistics nung time na yun, so hindi natin alam yung exact numbers, but people were feeling it. Ang dami naghahanap ng trabaho nung 1950s, and the government was engaged in a kind of deflationary policy that increased unemployment even more. And by the time nagkaroon tayo ng statistics, alam natin that by the late 1950s, pabagsak talaga ang employment at saka pataas talaga ang unemployment at underemployment nung panahon na yun. It's not a period of plenty.
I'll give you an example. What we're doing with the 1950s is like imagining a Filipino in year 2000, 120, whatever, 2090, for instance, right? Looking at our pictures in BGC, us shopping in Greenbelt.
Oo, sasabihin, mabuti pa nun.
Heart Evangelista with their Hermes and all that. Like, puti pa nung tayo na exactly. And pag-iwanan tayo ng Bangladesh, Cambodia, East Timor, di ba? It's like, it's a very shallow way of assessing saan tayo galing. Ako, Lelo, for me, I think it's more a psychological need. you want to feel that there was a day na may golden era tayo. Otherwise,
Oo.
nakakadismaya maging Pilipino, to be honest, no?
Oo, oo.
Kaya gusto mo makita
Malungkot.
yung eskolta, yung poshness. But I think we had glamour naman noon. I would say, culturally, not economical. I think we had more glamour, regional standard. Hindi kasing, medyo baduy na tayo ngayon. Yung mga elites natin, ang kitsch nila, bro. Sobrang
Oo.
notorish.
Yeah.
Sobrang kadiri. I'm not gonna say sino, pero I get like, no. I mean, like, don't try to, parang, alam mo, para silang mga, parang pa Dubai style. Hindi tayo oil-rich country. You don't party that way, my friend. Diba?
Yeah.
Kadiri.
Yeah. So, Marco,
No,
just
next, So Marcos will explain us pa tayo na pag-iwanan Thailand. So pag-usapan natin Thailand bago tayo pag-usapan.
So sobrang interesting sa akin nung 1970 election or 1970 depreciation of the peso. Now I was talking to Raul Fabella and I was asking him, "Sir, how do you think about how do we properly kasi he's the big advocate of peso depreciation, 'di ba?"
Yeah.
And I said, "Sir, the biggest peso depreciation of the 20th century was the 1970 peso depreciation of Marcos and Virata." Sabi ko, "Sir, how do we think about that?" Sabi sa akin ni Professor Fabella, depreciation has to be part of a broader export-oriented ecosystem. It cannot be a reactive depreciation. In other words, magde-depreciate ka dahil desperado ka na dahil meron kang balance of payments crisis. It has to be done from a position of strength, not a position of weakness.
And
Now,
part of an integrated strategy. Hindi yung
integrated strategy.
huling
Now, when you
bimbo.
So sabi niya, okay, balik tayo sa 1970. If you think about that, well, it was good na nag-depreciate, but it was done from a position of weakness. Bakit? Kasi for most of the 90 because that was a year when Marcos spent a lot of money to get re-elected. Kaya ka may balance of payments crisis, kaya ka nag-depreciate. So hindi siya strategic. So in a way, it becomes associated with the corruption of Marcos to begin with, as opposed to a bold protectionist measure.
I'll ask an uncomfortable question, bro. Do you think our quasi-democracy also was anti-development? The fact that our politicians had to spend so much money during elections and tweak everything for electioneering and election, posturing, that distracted us from long-term. I'm not making an excuse for authoritarian developmental state, but I cannot deny the evidence that a lot of our neighbors were able to industrialize without having to bother with the nonsensical elections we had, because the elections that were super corrupt elections. They're not legitimate elections. Yung second election ni Marcos was one of the most corrupt anywhere on earth, right?
Yeah.
The treasury was
parang yung natin, yung biggest balance of payment, during this period, mga mid-20th century, hindi nakakagulat na yung biggest balance of payments crisis natin were happening during election years. So prior to 1970,
it's not an argument against democracy, it's an argument against that super corrupt, flawed version of democracy. Just to be clear,
So prior to 1970, our last big balance of payment crisis was 1958. Re-election year ng favorite ng mga so-called nationalists dyan, si Carlos P. Garcia, si Filipino First, one of the worst presidents we've ever seen na romanticize ng ating mga comrade, di ba? So 1958, di ba? He just like Marcos, he used the levers of power and the import control system to reward his friends and to generate a balance of payments crisis in 1958. Same thing that happens in 1970 with Marcos. Yun yung big currency crisis mo eh. Election years both, Carlos Garcia and Ferdinand Marcos.
Now, Lelo, I mean, we have discussed the Marcos one a lot, but obviously, hindi tayo mapag-iwanan ng not only Thailand, but Indonesia and now Vietnam, if things were kind of fixed after Marcos, right? So the question is, how did things go so wrong after the collapse of the Marcos dictatorship? Even if, of course, let's agree, nag-inherit tayo ng sobrang daming utang, damage to institutions, I agree. So I will give half pass, let's say, to Corazon Aquino, because she inherited not 0, but -10. So if after her term, we were 2, that's still 12 points improvement, because she came from not 0, but -10 when she took over in 1986, which everyone tends to forget. And for me, Ramos was still the best. In fact, I got to know kanina, Leloy, the only time na walang lawyer na hindi AJK sa Pilipinas, sa kasaysayan ng Pilipinas, panahon ni Ramos. Apparently, under
Na ano?
only under Ramos, FBR, walang AJK na lawyer. Kasi kanina I was writing about EJK, extrajudicial killings. Extrajudicial killing.
Walang pinatay na abogado, you mean?
Abogado. Panahon lang ni FBR. So FBR had one of the safest time in terms of EJK.
Wow.
That's quite interesting, right? When you think about, this is an ex-military guy. But anyway, going back to this, the other thing I want to understand, Lelo, is was there an opportunity for the 1997 regime, Corazon Aquino, the whole elite that came back, to build the foundations for a developmental state and strong industrial policy? What are the critical junctures for you to bring it closer to our era? Or is this a balik of Cordero style of mindset? Did we just go back to zero again?
So, let's just okay,
so after Marcos, traumatized kasi tayo eh. Sobrang traumatized tayo ng developmentalism. So
Bro,
I don't think
lang my charger. Sorry, please go ahead.
Okay.
Charger.
So I think intellectually sobrang difficult to engage in developmentalism because Marcos had tainted developmentalism. In fact, what was developmentalism for some people, for other people became crony capitalism. Remember, the term crony capitalism was used to initially define the Marcos regime. So now we use the term crony capitalism to refer to Putin's regime. We used to refer it to, like, when AMNO engages in practices that lead to the one scandal. Pero originally, Marcos yun. And actually, if you look at yung policy ng crony capitalism at yung policy ng developmentalism, on paper, they're not very different. Because crony capitalism is funding crony companies, privileging crony companies. Developmentalism is about funding and privileging national champions. So ano yung diferensya? When it works, it's the developmental state. When it fails, it's crony capitalism. But it's actually the same set of policies, di ba?
Okay, I know you keep on saying that because you're getting it from a good friend in Kyoto. But there's actually an explanation for that, Leloy. In cases where developmental state work is where the state was in charge of the situation. They could bully and corral the oligarchs. So the term for that is reciprocal mechanisms, meaning the state provides you subsidy, the state provides you political protection, the state provides you all sorts of incentive, but in exchange, you have to strictly meet certain standards, especially export standards.
Yeah, so that's the developmental state.
But in the case of the Philippines, the tail was wagging the dog, right? The colonies controlled Marcos, not Marcos.
But anyway, on the surface, what I mean is, on the surface they look the same, right? When of course when you parse it, like,
and but they're both corrupt.
I'm not saying there's no reason for success. I'm not saying it's exactly, but on the surface the logic is the same. So it then becomes easy to use one thing to discredit the other. So for example, crony capitalism is used to discredit the developmental state. And you see this, for example,
I agree.
For example, after the Asian financial crisis in 1992, the IMF and the World Bank descended onto Southeast Asia and said that developmentalism is not going to work in Southeast Asia because developmentalism leads to crony capitalism. Look at the Asian financial crisis, diba? That's what yung Asian financial crisis in 92 Asian financial crisis is an important moment that the IMF used to discredit the developmental state, to discredit industrial policy.
Essentially, there are two forms of dirigiste. I mean, there are two forms of statist approach to national economic development, right? One is a failed one is a successful one. No, now I get what you're saying. No, you're right. They're essentially both driven development. One is may kulang, yung isa meron na siyang safety valve, all of that. Diba? May safeguards and all of the internal mechanisms of checks and balance.
So I would say that during the Aquino and Ramos period, we were traumatized by crony capitalism and therefore could not engage in its like nicer version, which was developmentalism, because they were so tied to each other. And then, of course, the international context, I don't think, Richard, was very accommodating to it. Because
neoliberalism.
Now the international context, okay sila with industrial policy. Biden is going to use the word industrial policy, but at the time, this is Clinton, this is Blair, this is IMF structural adjustment, this is the World Bank criticizing Southeast Asian countries for crony capitalism after the Asian financial crisis. So You cannot, this is not a time where domestically and internationally you can utter the words industrial policy. This is the time where those words are verboten. So what do you expect to do? And that's why during the 1990s, ang notion ng cleaning up ni Ramos was privatization, right? That was the name of the game. The government was getting out of the way of private companies. But now mahirap talaga for Ramos to do anything else because yun yung yun yung diskurso nung mga panahon na yun. But I would
Neoliberal
say
hegemony. Essentially, you're saying neoliberal hegemony just nipped it in the bud. Any infatuation or flirtation.
That's what I think. But now, sorry, just to fast forward a little bit, we don't have that excuse now, Richard. Because Biden,
that's why I wrote what I wrote. Exactly.
Biden himself is using the words industrial policy.
That's why I wrote what I wrote, because my sense is this is our second chance, if I can put it that way. Because ang basa ko dito is for all the conspiracy of factors that you and I explained, no? I love how he did it, because he explained the first half of 20th century, which perfectly jives with my argument on state formation, no? Yung libertarian state formation na meron tayo, and you even mentioned the libertarian backlash. And then yung time ni Marcos, the problem was, forget about Korea and Taiwan, but even Thailand we couldn't beat because it was the tail wagging the dog than the other way around. Kasi spectrum yan, di ba? So high success rate, let's say in Japan and Korea, Thailand somewhere in the middle. In the Philippines, talagang mga cronies were running the show, right? In one way or another. In either lack of knowledge, lack of capacity, etc. But I want to raise this argument. What do you think about the argument of this? I don't know how to put it.
Can I backtrack a little bit before you ask the question? Just to your point. Gusto ko lang kasi balikan yung op-ed mo, pare. Kasi history will forgive Fidel V. Ramos for not engaging in extensive industrial policy. It was too difficult at that time given the trauma of the Marcos regime and given the discourse of global economics. History will not forgive or should not forgive Ferdinand Marcos Jr. for not engaging in industrial policy today because there are no excuses. That's what I think.
Very good point, because I think we have exactly the same sensibility on this issue. And suddenly I forgot. No, I didn't forget. No, my question here, Lelo, is this. I was listening to a podcast again about Confucianism. No, I hate these cultural arguments, but I cannot ignore. I think it may explain a bit or two. Like in Confucian culture, for instance, public service is a noble job. It's a highly prestigious job. No. And there's always this idea of the obligation of the ruling elite to the society, to the people, to the collective, as a family, right? So there is that kind of elite public service culture, which is very ancient, very deep in China, but also in every country influenced by China. Guess what? This is practically all countries we mentioned. Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, Japan. They're all scenic culture products, right? Products of scenic culture. And in all of these countries, the idea of being a technocrat working in their meaty Ministry of International Trade and Industry, whatever, is a source of prestige, diba? And there are people who give their entire life to fight for strong industrial policy. I mean, I'm sure just like me, I mean, you stayed also in Japan for quite some time. If you meet the government officials there, they're obsessed about their work, right? They're obsessed. Hindi yung nakatatlong manyanita and all of that, you know? You get what I'm saying? So I hate to use this culturalist argument, but a while ago you said something like, more or less meron tayong dependency culture dun sa elite natin. They never developed this outward risk-taking, very risk-averse ang elite natin because they were always insulated. And that kind of reminds me of someone in the Malacanang right now who's very risk-averse because he was always insulated and had everything easy. He didn't even have to graduate from college. He's now the president. You know, like, you get what I'm saying? I don't even know.
Tapos, risk. Pero hindi naman siya bobo. Actually, medyo matalino pa nga siya, and he can get away with things
yung mga elites natin matatalino naman yung mga elites natin. You and I have met the elites in this country. We don't have, actually, kausap mo, matalino sing lahat. Ang tanong, may paki ba sa bansa? Yun yung tanong talaga eh. Yun, actually, I rather talk to Robin Hood Padilla kasi feeling ko may paki siya sa bansa natin. You know, we can debate about this grasp of facts.
Sabi niya si Manny, si Pacquiao daw, may ganung sentiment. I've never met the guy, but I've heard consistently said.
You're absolutely right. So, so yun nga yung point ko, bro. I mean, kaya nga sabi ko kanina, parang nangyari dito is the Philippine elite over and over sold the soul of the nation in exchange for their own market access to the United States. And there was never a strong state or bureaucracy to discipline them and force them to kind of care more about long-term. Kasi risky, di ba? I mean, risky gumawa ng manufacturing. Di ba, Lelo? Many things could go wrong. And one of the things that, of course, is also a big problem, actually na-raise ng one of our fans dito, Lelo, is power rates. Power rates are very in the Philippines. We didn't even mention it. So we have to go to factor endowments. One of the biggest problems for the Philippines is ang mahal ng presyo ng electricity. So that tells you there's something going also wrong with our basic infrastructure, which is very much dominated by only few families and conglomerates. So let's talk about that, because again, that also tells you hopeless case talaga manufacturing sa Philippines kung hindi natin ayusin itong very, very basics na yan eh. I'm sure you have something to say on that, no?
Yung power, actually, I have to admit, bakit nga ba mahal ang power? This is not something I've looked into extensively. Alam ko na mahal yung power just because as somebody who used to pay for electricity, Meralco in the Philippines, and now pays for power in the most expensive city in the world, or the most expensive metropolitan area in the world, the Bay Area, panalo pa rin yung, mas mahal pa rin yung Pilipinas.
Yeah, so, except I mean you're in a place that earns 20 times more on average, right?
Oo, and mas mura ang kuryente ko dito. Bakit ganon? Ano nangyari, Bes? I don't know. Anong alam mo dito, Richard?
I mean, of course, this is partly an offshoot of the privatization that went wrong in the 1990s, right? Partly there's an explanation for that, diba? Obviously, then other explanation is geographic. Wala tayong national grid, yung transmission between different islands. But Indonesia has 3 times more islands than us. They're almost 3 times. They have 18,000 islands, and yet hindi kasi mahal sa Pilipinas. Now, so I always hear excuses, Leloy. I always hear excuses. But ang suspicion ko dito, may talaga, operator element dito na hindi inayos ng gobyerno and all. Kaya tama si Tatay Digong talaga nung inaway niya yung mga oligarchs, except he was fighting against the wrong oligarchs while promoting his own oligarchs, Duterte-garchs, no? But yun nga din doon mo rin makita yung weakness. Feeling ko the power rates being very high in the Philippines is a reflection of a more fundamental problem with with the weakness of our state institutions. And this is where, again, I don't want to give an excuse to Bongbong Marcos. Pero ang tanong ko dito, Leloy, is Marcos will have to make banga-banga to many big boys. So, ang proposal ko, and I was just writing on that a while ago before, kaya medyo na-late ako ng konti, hinahabol ko is, yan ang dapat konteksto sana ng EDCA and defense and all. Sana yung isang component ng strategic repivot ng Pilipinas sa mga allies natin is also them helping us to modernize our infrastructure and all. And if necessary, provide political support for BBM if and when he gets backlash from the bad boys. Whether this is, who, or the business versions of that. Kasi, Leloy, there's no way the Philippines can be economically competitive if we don't do some of the basics, including ugly infrastructure, chronic corruption, something with the power situation, price manipulation, all of that. Pero for Marcos, who's so risk-averse, he needs backup. So my argument is the West shouldn't just look at the Philippines like Fortress Asia or New Pearl Harbor. They should help the Philippines to become a dynamic economy also, so that they can become a stable, reliable ally. Because kung sabog ang Pilipinas yung economy natin, we're gonna elect another Duterte literally or figuratively soon, right? And then we're going to be again China province contender, di ba? So I think yun din ang problema na with BBM, he may be risk averse himself, but if our top allies give him a little bit of push, nudge him in the right direction, then maybe we can make some changes in the next few years. So when I was in Taiwan,
ganyan daw. I mean, just I've heard chismis about people who've talked to him. Na yun nga, matalino, that if you explain to him something and if you persuade him, he'll be like, yeah, I see the point in that, let's do that. But yung execution, minsan he will become timid because natatakot or mabait, ganyan. So yan daw yung personality eh. So it's like even if you can convince him intellectually, you need to push his will, right? And how do you push the guy's will? Yun yung mahirap.
Yun nga, that's why I'm saying the big boys should come in. I mean, the Americans, the Europeans, the Japanese, they have to gently tell them, BBM, ay yung Philippine, forever na kayong ganyan. Sana naman, konting ayusin mo, tulungan kita dito, bigyan kita ng support dito, capacity building dito. And then yung EU, sabihin, we will sign a free trade agreement with you, ayusin mo naman ng konti dito, tulungan ka namin ng dito. Like, I know it's not easy, but I think it's doable. I mean, there's some examples I saw na, for instance, dun sa Hanjin Yard, sa yung Korean Hanjin Yard, na bibilin muntik ng mga Chino, panahon ni Digong pa yan. Nag-lobby ang Philippines, tumulong ang Japan, Australia, US, kinuha ng isang American company para hindi makuha ng mga Chinese. So, we have some micro evidences of coordinated, let's say.
Kayang laruin.
Bro, yun na yung sinasabi ko. Kasi my argument is, sige, sabihin natin si BBM mabait sa West. Pero kung Pilipinas, mahirap pa rin 5 years from now. Ganito pa rin kasabog yung situation. Alam mo naman, sino naman mananalo sa politika natin, and we'll never be a reliable ally. We'll never be a reliable even security partner. Forget about... So, dapat mag-invest na sila sa Pilipinas talaga. Now, I saying that, but you see, this is a capacity building assistance, what I'm saying. And it just happens that you're right. You're absolutely right. BBM, smart siya. But he's a bit too practical. like, why should I risk myself? Life is good. I keep on winning. Why should I put it? Ayaw niya maging martyr. Ayaw niya maging martyr.
Tsaka for all of, and yun nga, back to the excuses, not just BBM, but from the time of his father all the way to him, the biggest excuse for people to be timid is the fact that we need foreign reserves, we need foreign currency. In other words, kailangan may bumalik na dollar sa atin sa Pilipinas. And conventionally, the way you do that is through exports, right? The Philippines has not needed to boost its exports. We remain a net importer until today, and that is because of, from the 80s onwards, OFW. Diba? OFW has allowed us to be timid. Tinatawag natin silang and again, this is a gift, but this is also a curse, like US free trade agreement. Totoo nga, bagong bayani talaga sila. They do keep our economy afloat, but we've created a reliance on them, and then from the Arroyo period naman onwards, we created a reliance on our BPO industry, because BPO also brings in foreign currency sa atin, because effectively it's a kind of foreign investment. Pero yung OFW siguro wala siya ganong taning, because the world will always need employment, and as places like Japan age, for example, as other places age, they're going to need our young workforce. But of course, kahit walang taning yun, it's a great idea to keep the Philippines, to keep a lot of our talent home. I feel this as somebody who I think I'm part of, I'm hindi naman nagmamayabang, pero I'm a decent employee for the Philippines, and I think I'm part of Brain Drain. And I was just reading Business World the other day. We are one of the parang out of 65 ata, number 60 tayo in terms of maintaining quality talent sa Pilipinas. Out of 65 countries, we are number 60.
Losing the best of the best. Not just Brain Drain, but the best.
We are one of the least attractive countries for maintaining quality talent. Right? Baka next thing you know, kahit si Richard Hidario umalis na ng Pilipinas. Hindi natin alam. Kasi number 60
lang muna ako, Ibiza. Okay, wow, tumagal itong episode na ito, bro. But I like it because this is a very honest and serious discussion. Ako naman, hope ko lang, no? Marami tayong actually mga followers, Leloy, ng mga OFWs na kapatid. Yung iba nga, minimension pa yung Dutch disease. Of course, in the case of the Dutch, because they discovered natural gas. Well, for some reason,
Tama.
Right?
Thank you.
So, I mean, so you see how educated the comments are, how advanced.
Thank you, mga kabeta. That's good.
Yeah, tuwan-tuwa yung mga tao sa discussion natin. Marami tayong mga kasama from OFWs. So, I hope, our OFW Filipino communities who are abroad, na pinag-aaralan talaga. Kasi feeling ko, there are some sections of our OFW community who happen to be in authoritarian but prosperous countries. So ang basa nila, ang kailangan lang natin isang tatay and everything will be okay. But we also have many OFWs who have a more nuanced understanding bakit country X is richer than Philippines, why this country. And I hope those OFW brothers sisters of ours, wherever they come from, they'll be more involved in pushing for the right kind of political discourse. Hindi yung mga bobo style na, mag-parliamentary tayo, automatically everything will be fine. Sorry. I mean, ayan yung mga simplistic. Sorry, I wanted to say simplistic. Yung mga ganyan. Hindi, asan yung more...
Although fan ako ng parliamentary, fan ako ng parliament.
I mean, I'm for parliamentary, but I have no illusion that that alone will solve everything.
Yes.
Kasi we have to talk about kaya nga industrial policy, isang oras na natin pag-usapan ngayon. I'm just hoping our OFW community, increasingly like what we see in China, in India, and other countries, could become a microcosm for transformative discourse and transformative policy in the Philippines, no, down the road. Baka, who knows, in a few years, babalik yung mga katulad mo, they'll be in government.
Yeah, yun nga eh. Yun nga sabi ko eh. Parang, I
naman
hope for a
always.
Philippines na pwede nating uwian na parang, wag naman sana number 60 out of 65 in terms of keeping talent. Wag naman. Grabe naman.
Kahit
Ang
30
sakit
lang.
naman. Ang sakit na. Kahit nasa gitna man lang.
30, okay na yan.
Just don't be at the bottom of the world.
Exactly.
Yun
Hindi
naman.
naman kami over-ambitious.
Oo.
Ano naman yung mga katulad nila, yung mga Berkeley boys, medyo makabalik naman sa atin in the coming years.
Actually, for
Magpayaman
people
ka muna.
Gusto ko naman talagang bumalik. So, yun yung isang exhaust valve OFW. And then, just going back to our last episode, yung other exhaust valve natin, yung call center, sa tingin ko talaga, pare may tanning yan eh. Kasi, yayariin na yan ng generative AI very soon. So, yung tanning niyan is, we're gonna have a comeuppance really soon, and we're not going to be able to rely as much on BPO for our foreign reserves. So, pag nangyari yon, ano na lang ang source mo for foreign reserves? OFW na lang. That's going to be a very, very heavy burden on their backs. Tulungan natin sila. Paano natin sila tutulungan? Industrial policy para hindi nila kargada ang ekonomiya ng Pilipinas.
I mean, my hope is, Leloy, will be more like Taiwan than South Korea. In what sense? If you look at Taiwan, they're very dependent on small and medium enterprises, and which have kept them very competitive. Kasi I always, if we can have good chaebols in the Philippines, the feeling ko talagang trapuhan eh. But if you look at Taiwan, they're driven by many world-class small and medium enterprises, which are integrated into a kind of a bigger supply chain. No? If you can go in that, because marami tayong OFWs, Leloy, na hindi bilyonaryo, pero milyonaryo, who can make small and medium enterprises na world-class. So if we can bring back 10,000, 20,000 Filipino businessmen from, I don't know, from California to Spain to United Arab Emirates, Hong Kong, and they bring in investments, export-oriented, that in itself could modernize our country and push it.
Nabanggit ko na to dati, pero wala na akong statistics eh. Pero ang liit ng pondo ng DTI, pare. Department of Trade and Industry, which is supposed to encourage small and medium enterprises and support them. Ang liit ng pondo niyan. I actually imagine a world where you have a really powerful DTI and yung DTI secretary is as prominent and as powerful as the Secretary of Finance. So yung DTI secretary mo, pwede makipagbanggaan sa finance secretary mo. Pwede siyang Bendiocno level in terms of power. Dahil we care about small and medium enterprises so much that we've empowered our DTI secretary to that level. So I think that's one
You're
intervention.
Right. I mean, for me,
prioritizing DTI as a branch of government, as a cabinet office.
Otherwise, bro, isama mo na lang like DFAT ng Australia, isama mo yung DFA and DTI para integrated yung commercial diplomacy mo and foreign policy.
I like that. I like that.
In that sense, augmented yung yung strength mo, 'di ba? Literally, they can be part DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So yun yung Australian strategy. So I don't know. Basta in short, the status quo doesn't
I like that, bro.
And usually our DTI secretaries are yung parang number 2 ng dating isa pang secretary. Yun yung mga ganun yung mga nagtrabaho.
Unless ikaw si Marojas, unless ikaw si Marojas, Mr. Palengke, hindi ka sisikat sa DTI.
Yes, I mean, and unless you're Rojas, like Araneta Rojas for that matter.
Well, to be fair to Mark, he made something of that office, no? Kasi not a lot of people make a lot out of the DTI office, but it's also yung dynamic, diba? How much is your principal going to empower you? To be fair to GMA, she did empower Mark.
And she also worked in DTI, diba? She also worked in siya. So I think nagkatugma na dalawang matalinong ekonomista na sa power. So nag-jive yung utak nila, no? So sana, I don't know. I mean, I know BBM likes our current DTI secretary very much. even if many don't like the current DTI secretary, DTI, no? DTI. But you're absolutely right. Yung mga small things like that, strengthening bureaucracy, the right department, that's extremely important. Now, I know we went super overtime, bro. My God, I thought we are gonna have 20 minutes. It became more than almost 1.5 hour tong topic na to. But I think this is the most important. To be honest, if you're gonna ask me, for me, this is the most important topic in the Philippines that is not being discussed. Industrial policy. And we did it in a non-ideological way. We didn't do it in a Marxist way. We didn't do it in a liberal way. We're coming at it in a historical, evidence-based,
and also very non-partisan, because
and comparative.
this is advice we would give, or this is an insight we would give for Noynoy Aquino, for Rodrigo Duterte, for Ferdinand Marcos, for Leni Robredo. That op-ed you wrote, bro, kung sila na yung presidente, I think you would have written the same op-ed.
Oh yeah.
You don't care. You want the country to succeed.
Did anyone talk about industrial policy aside from Calyodi? Like, Calyodi is probably the one who talk about labor unions and industry. Well, no one else talks about these things, and yet this is the most important thing. And bilang Pilipino, tama ka talaga. Love na love ko yung sinabi mo, pare. As a Filipino, I want to see a Filipino brand car or technology one day. Yung mga Chinese na nga, they're all over the place. 10 years ago, they were taga-manufacture lang ng ano. So, Vietnam na nga, nandun na. Indonesia is getting theirs. Kaya naman natin yan eh. Yung konting ano lang, move here and there. Para naman, hindi lang purong Formula 1. Baka naman one day, kasama tayo sa Formula 1. May sarili tayong ano dyan sa Ferrari, diba? Ganda sana, lalo, mano tayo ng Grand Prix in Manila. Diba? Manila. Feeling ko si Ramon. Si Ramon ang may plano.
Hindi kaya kasi dami masyadong lubak mga kalsada natin, pare.
Hindi. Gagawa ng circuit talaga. Separately. Di ba may bagong airport na gagawin nila Ramon ang? Feeling ko gagawa siya tabi nun. Kaya nga he brought Ferrari to Manila. By the way, Ferrari is open. Wow. And trivia, Philippines was the first Asian country where Ferrari was sold. 1956. Wow. Ayan. So may glamour talaga tayo. It's true na may glamour talaga tayo 50s. Yun lang, smoke and mirrors glamour. Yun lang problema. Kaya hindi na-sustain. Thank you so much, Leloy. Maybe we can talk next time na lang about red tagging and other topics. Medyo na-drain tayo pareho. This was amazing, bro. 1.5 hours. So, saan ka pa, di ba? 1.5 hours on industrial policy. Talo pa natin yung mga lectures sa class. And
isang daang taon eh. So, kailangan talaga eh.
And the next 1,000 years. And the next 1,000 years for the Philippines. My goodness. Thank you so much, bro. Before we close this, again, happy birthday to you, bro. Congratulations for finishing your new book. God bless. I really look forward to reading it. I'm more than happy to talk about your book, son. Well, I owe you a nice dinner because people are contributing, I think, for your, yun, baka gusto niyo magbigay ng cash dyan, Gcash dyan para kay Leloy, di ba? And I'm super proud, bro, of your achievements, and I'm super proud and happy that I have had the opportunity of sharing my thoughts with you, because I think we really bounce off on each other very well. You could see, like, you'll say this, I'll think of this, I'll think of that, you'll say that. Yung sobrang, I like this.
Pareho patayong hyper.
I really like, except, in yours is early morning, mine is midnight, but it's okay. My circadian cycles are different. So please, bro, continue to do that. Continue to take care of yourself. Have a happy birthday. And I'm proud of you. Stay awesome, pare. Stay awesome, pare.
Stay awesome, and keep pushing and enjoy your as always, enjoy your Sabbath. Pahinga ka na.
You, bro. And wag kang mag-jelly sa amin ni Ronald. Kung may R&D kami, may Nexus naman tayo.
Sige.
Thank you, bro. Love you.
Bye.
Adios. Bye.